of the biggest problems and one of the most frequent habits, if you like, is that a lot of people, when they begin to paint on pure white surfaces. So they buy a canvas or a piece of card or whatever, and they go straight into the painting. And the problems with this, there's two types of problem. One is psychological, one is technical, practical. The psychological level, and that's a big thing actually, is that we get intimidated by that white canvas. It's pure, it's untouched. What if we make a mistake? So, if I have this pristine piece of light surface, I'm bound to be intimidated by it. And it goes back to childhood. It goes back to a lot of reasons, actually. If you remember a childhood or your school days when you were given very light pieces of paper, or you had this blank sheet of paper, it suggests things like examinations, that the mark you put down there is the final mark you make. And if it's wrong, there's going to be a problem, and so on. So the idea of a light surface goes deeper, if you like, than just that practical side. There's a lot of psychology goes on in that. If, for instance, if I get this other sheet of paper, black sheet of paper, surprise, surprise, it's been primed with a dark primer. So if we look at that, it's already been used, it's already been painted on it. So that perfection has been destroyed, and we're less intimidated. And we're not afraid to say, well, it's already been destroyed, it's already been muddied up, if you like. Let's go ahead and do something with it. We're more relaxed. Just on that very basic level, that's why it is very useful not to paint on pure white. Now, what we're going to do in this video is have a look at some examples of that, and also have a look at the actual technical end of why it's good to paint on a dark ground. It's always important to look at the history and the context of ideas behind painting, and we're looking here today at the idea of working on darker backgrounds, darker surfaces, and there are no greater exponents of this probably than looking at the Dutch masters of the 17th century, Dutch still life painters in particular. This is a painting by Peter Claes, who is a great exponent of this, and you can see obviously it's a dark picture with the light drawn from it, and it's a great example of how the artist has added light onto dark, or drawn light out of darkness. And of course Rembrandt, the great master himself, portraitures in particular. But this is a great example of how he has us feel that the viewer is coming right out towards us, out of the shadows. And again, it's about squeezing the light from the darkness. So he begins with dark and works the light into that, and not certainly beginning on pure white canvas or white board. We looked earlier at a couple of sheets of card, one which was primed very light and one which was primed or underpainted in black. So what I've done here, following on from the inspiration of the great Dutch painters, if you like, I've drawn on both of these pieces a simple little shape of a pear. What I'm going to try to do is create a nice deep dark shady chiaroscuro effect on each one, and compare how working on a light background compares to a black or dark ground. The first thing, as we mentioned earlier, is psychological, and you can see here I have this bright sort of surface right in front of me, which is intimidating slightly. But the first thing is really when I'm confronted with a light area like this, obviously the first thing I've got to do is get some darks in there. So I'm working dark onto light immediately. The second thing is I've got to decide, okay, this is a certain tone, this is a certain tone, and that's a certain tone. So throughout this picture, based on the little photograph that I'm working from, I've got to decide which of these areas is which tone and hopefully place them together and get the painting beginning to work. So really, that tends to encourage me to work in what I call a colouring in way. In other words, I tend to see the picture as being something that I've got to fill in gaps side by side, rather than drawing colour and tone and atmosphere out of the painting. So, for example, if I also was to put on paint here, which is relatively thin, and when we work with oils, we're generally encouraged to work thin first and then thicker, heavier, oilier paint on top. But of course, the problem here is, as you can see, I have a little brush here. If I was to put on paint which has been slightly thinned there, I'm going to be working in just black and white at the moment. You can see that the light colour from the ground is coming through that. It's not particularly dark simply because the paint I'm putting on is slightly diluted, slightly thin, but it's not covering up. So therefore, I've got to be working perhaps in layers to get to that point where I kill off the white. So what happens is it tempts me and inclines me to want to work with thicker paint in order to do that. So if I put some thicker paint on my brush now, you can see that that's going on there. Yes, it is covering, and that's okay, but it's thicker, it's oilier, and much more difficult to work on top. So if I want to change that, the chances are my paint will skid across it, and it makes life difficult. And the chances again are I might have to let that dry before I go any further. So it can kind of slow the process down a bit. So there's another, if you like, disadvantage about working onto light surfaces. What I'm going to do is at least try to work my way through this and create at least some of the major tones. So I'm going to work around, I've decided, let's work around the background first. I'm going to make a sort of a deep grey here. The other problem is that it's quite difficult to assess which tones will be which, because as I put this tone down right now around the background area, just to block that in, I have no information anywhere around the rest of the picture to tell me what I'm comparing it to. So I've got to be very, very careful in trying to match this tone that I'm putting on as I go. In other words, I've got to look very closely at my subject, the original subject, in order to do that. And the chances are it's one of those things that it rarely is correct first time anyway. So the chances are I'll still have to change that. So I'm just bashing in these areas, and what I might do with the video itself is speed through this little bit so that we can get you to see what happens next. Now, as I do this, I just want to, before I go any further, I just want to put a little more paint on here. What I'd like to do is at least get paint around both sides. So I'm using a flat brush for this. I tend to prefer flat brushes and maybe filbert brushes rather than round brushes, but when I work, that is purely a personal thing. I think we all find the tools and the devices that work best for us. But you can see I've made the one statement here very boldly, very basically, that there is a dark background, which is true. I know that the background in this picture, in this source, in this this painting that I want to do is fairly dark. So I've achieved that. But I've still got this light center area that I haven't yet addressed. And again, going back to the psychology of it, there's this feeling that that's occupied and that's empty. And oh my goodness, I've got to fill up the empty bits now, which is true. But you don't see the picture as any sort of complete unit at the moment. It still looks like there's a hole cut out of a piece of grey card. It doesn't give me any sense of the form and what's going on until I get this occupied. So I've got to keep working through this process of what I would call coloring in, which is a very crude thing, if you like. But what I'm doing here is I'm going to put on some of the indicators here of the very dark shadow. So I'm doing that here. I'm looking at my little original subject. There's a dark block of shadow here, and then there's another really large area going down around here. So these will all be melded together in due course. But just to hammer home, if you like, or show you that at every step when we're working on white or light, there's a feeling that it's very bitty. You know, until you get through this part of it, it looks very bitty. It looks incomplete. In other words, if someone said to me, you've got to stop painting now for a while, you've got to leave that, or maybe I can't paint anymore at it, that's what I would have. This is what I would have, which doesn't really satisfy me at all, because it's, as I say, also in bits. So I'm going to work through this, putting in the rest of the bits until we at least get some sort of complete unit, if you like, of an image. What you can see here now is where I've effectively blocked in the major areas of tonal variation. And what I can do now by wiping my brush clean, and whilst the oil paint is still wet, I can just take and very gently try to blend these areas together. So as I blend one into the other, you can see the softness of that. Wipe my brush, remove the paint that I've just taken onto the brush, soften in that very dark area into that light area, wipe the brush again. And so in other words, I'm going along the edges of the various blocks of light and shade, and you can see how they begin to soften together. Now, while I do that, of course, that changes them, because the things that were very, very dark will not be so dark, because I have mixed them slightly with the lighter things beside them. So I've got to correct that later on. But we are beginning to see how this pear shape hopefully is not going pear-shaped. Excuse that terrible joke. But you can see as I work these areas in here that the object, the pear, is beginning to take something of a sense of form, something of a sense of three-dimensionality. And you can see that wiping that brush is very important. Otherwise, all we do is continue to carry dark paint into light and light into dark, and the result is that the whole thing then simply becomes one, if you like, flat grey again. So once we do that, we can reinforce it again. We can go back in and just darken those little areas again, and wipe the brush again, because we're working with wet paint. So we're working wet into wet. And one of the, if you like, going back to the disadvantages, is the paint is skidding around now because it's so wet. So my ability to control it is limited by how long I can do this for before the paint gets so wet that it doesn't really work anymore, and I have to stop. There's a little light edge along there that I would like to put in, but you can see that because it's skidding on the wet paint, it's a little bit more difficult to control. So my brush marks have to be very, very, very light indeed. But you can see at least we're getting somewhere with regards to the sense of light and shade. What I'll do actually is just indicate something of the little stem here. It's probably a little darker than that anyway. So if I put that in there, just a little line and a little mark in there. So we're beginning to form this thing up. What I realize, of course, is I want that light edge to jump out more. So that means I realize that the background is in fact quite a bit darker than what I originally put on, which is commonplace, where usually we misjudge the tones in the early stages. That's what it's about. Constantly changes. So you can see as I darken that area, this is beginning to throw this shape forward for me. Likewise, I could do the same probably on the other side. I know down here that's a very dark area right underneath here. You can see that. So as I put a dark area beside that light, that little area of reflected light there, you can see that causes the pear to jump out a little bit better. But it's got to the stage where it's all pretty wet and I'm struggling to try and control everything. In other words, the more I brush, the more I tend to be losing the tones. And this is where we may get to the point where I've got to leave this to dry a little bit at least and then move on. So whilst we've achieved something with this, working on light, the drawbacks have been this colouring in problem block by block before I start to see anything emerging. The second thing is the wetness of the paint. The paint has to be very thick really to try and organise it, to kill everything off. So you've an awful lot of work to do to get to this stage, to get some feeling of the atmosphere of this dark object in a dark room, if you like. Here now is our black sheet. And I certainly feel when I look at this, as I mentioned before in the video, that I feel a bit more relaxed. I don't have light glaring me in the face. You know, my eyes confronted by bright tones. So that's one of the things. As I said before, I know that I've darkened it and I've thrown paint on quite boldly over it to get this darkness onto this piece of card. So I don't feel as precious maybe about it as I did with the white one. But this time what I want to do is think about the way we get the paint onto this. Think about the way we apply the paint. The painting we worked on the light card, I mentioned to you that it demanded that we tended to paint quite thickly or thicker, simply because we've got a white surface and we have to cover that up just to get to the point where we get any feeling of the atmosphere of the light, this lovely dramatic light that's on the object. So there was a lot of work to be done to get to that stage. What I'm going to do with this is introduce a light first. In other words, I don't have to worry so much about, oh my goodness, I've got to occupy the dark areas. It is dark. So now what I'm going to try to do is think about pulling the light out of it. The way I'm going to do that is actually with extremely thin paint. Now what I mean by thin paint is not runny paint, but paint that's dry. It's straight from the tube, but it's applied to the brush very minimally. So in other words, I'm just putting a little bit of paint on my brush at the minute, and you can see if I hold my hand here and just put that on, you can see that that's really a small amount of paint. It's not a big thick lump of paint. It's really, and what I'm actually doing now, believe it or not, is I'm now going to wipe that even more. So there's even less paint on that little brush. I don't know if you can see how little there is on the tip. So what I'm going to do this time is gently encourage the light out of this. So I'm looking for the light areas in the object, which I know tend to be on this right hand side. So this time you'll probably hear me rubbing the brush on the board. And the more I rub, the more paint comes off. The less and more lightly I rub, the less paint comes off. So therefore, down here, for instance, you can see that I'm not rubbing very, very hard. I'm trying to be delicate. So the black is allowed to come through, influence the white, and create a grey. Whereas here, I've spent a lot of time rubbing until I've got as much paint as I can off the brush onto the board, and therefore that's a little bit lighter. So if I work on that principle and pick out the various areas of light and shade that I see, I can establish some sort of tonal relationships. So I know there's a bright area here. I know there's a bright area down somewhere here, a very bright area. So I'm putting that in as a nice big light area. What I'm doing now, again, I'm wiping the brush. So there's hardly any paint on there. And the dregs of the paint that are on, I'm just rubbing that around the edges of the very light area that I've just put on. And it's a relatively slow process, but it makes a big impact. So as I keep rubbing around these areas here, and in fact I know that this whole area has got some light on it, but these are the two lightest parts, and I can just work that. I could work with a bigger brush, of course, but you can hear that. You can hear that almost is a clean brush that I'm working with. And yes, I do eventually need to put more paint onto it, of course, but it's amazing that with one amount of paint, how much I can do this before I need to reload the brush. So what I'll do is I've got that area up here, which is slightly lighter, but not as light as the highlights. Then if I come over to the other side, I know that there's what's called reflected light on the object. You can see that the light has hit this side, it's bounced onto a wall on the left-hand side and come back over here. So it's going to have a slightly light edge. So again, with a little delicate rub of light down there, that side, it's a bit less there. And there's a little nice bit underneath just here. And what I'm going to do again, wipe the brush one more time. So there's really, I'm working with the paint that's already on here. And I'm going to rub that to create a slightly softer edge along that side to create, if you like, my reflected light area on this side. And it comes in here because there's this little shoulder on the pear. So you can see that. So if I rub around there, I can create that slight roundness that goes on there, and rub all the way down there. So everything about it is nice and soft. That's the first thing. But we just keep rubbing. I haven't reloaded the brush for a long time again. I'm just rubbing that around. And of course the stem again, the little stem, we've got to get a little bit of light and dark on that. There's a lovely highlight on that. So I'll put a little bit more paint on there because it is quite a strong light just catching the edge of that there. And we can come back to all of this again. And then I can also come back to this and say, okay, there are lovely little sparks of light somewhere up around here. So I can put a little bit of highlight there, a little bit of highlight here. Wipe the brush again because there's plenty of paint on there. And if I rub that in and just meld that into the background, if you like, and the same thing again with this little highlight, just meld that around like that, I can begin to see the form appearing. So if someone said to me, you've got to finish now, unlike the painting on white board, I have got a sense of form beginning to happen. I've got an atmosphere that this is an object that's in a dark space with a strong light. And that has been achieved quite considerably quicker than what it took me to do the work on the white card. And the additional bonus is that this paint is so thin, in fact, when I rub it like that, it's not coming off on the finger, which means I have the scope to put on, for example, other colors. They'll sit on top, unlike the previous painting, which was thick and oily and was skidding around everywhere and really needed to be left alone for a while. I'm just going to rub that little bit in to soften that, just because it's bothering me slightly. So you can see how chiaroscuro, as it's called, the use of light and shade can be applied, and the benefit of drawing light out of the darkness. We can go on here, we can continue with this technique using just white and rubbing it in, or I can, if I want, begin to introduce different greys, but even then they can be applied thinly like this, because at any given time when I stop, at least this looks like a pear that's in a light sunlight or strong light. Okay, folks, hopefully you find that piece of video useful for you. I think there are three main things, if you like, I would encourage you to think about. Remember that working on pure white ground very often makes you feel intimidated and frightened to make a start. Second thing is, it tends to encourage you to paint in little bits. As I said before, a bit like colouring in. The third thing is that it makes it very difficult to watch the painting grow as a whole rather than seeing it as a little series of jigsaw pieces, if you like. So I would encourage you to practice this. Don't be afraid to lay down a dark layer of paint before you begin. And that layer of paint can simply be diluted oil paint, very slightly diluted. It can be black if you want, it can be a dark brown or whatever. But you must put these things into practice and practice overcoming the fear. What's the worst that can happen? You can wipe it all away or you can throw it away. So hopefully you'll go and try that. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you'll be able to see some more of these videos. Thank you.